I'll talk about secondary data analysis. Now I'll just speak for a few minutes, and then we can have a Q&A at the end. And I hope people have got enough time that they can stay for that. And I apologise that we're running slightly over. So briefly, I'll talk about what is secondary data analysis and what's our evidence that we have, and why people might choose secondary data analysis in the pandemic, and the potential, and some resources that we're aware of through this project that have engaged with our project that we've been doing. So secondary data analysis, it does have contested definitions, and you know, I'm sure that there are experts in the room, as it were, that do secondary data analysis, but there's analysing existing data collected for another purpose, and this might involve analysis of somebody else's data, or revisiting one's own data, for old data for a new purpose. And sources can include things like panel and cohort studies, agency data, other research projects. And one of the reasons that I think it's important in this context is that a lot of what we're talking about is about recruitment and elicitation, whereas this is perhaps more around the design and analysis, or those are kinds of issues that come up in secondary data analysis. So our evidence draws on all the work streams that we had. We have some COVID-19 publications that we're using cohort and panel study data. There's blogs and discussions, and our workshop as well. So some of the examples for using secondary data, several studies have used the Understanding Society data, which is a UK longitudinal study of households to investigate the pandemic and restrictions that are happening. And those have particularly been around, I mean, quite a theme is around inequalities. So there's disproportionate effects on those with lower incomes, and gender differences in effects on how care and work. So for example, because females tend to work in more essential roles, that their work has been less affected in some cases, but and the males in households have taken on more childcare, for example. There's been learning inequalities due to primary school closures in the Netherlands, and they've got some good quality data there. Changes in human-animal relations, and that has shown that there's increases in interest in dog adoption in Israel, and I think there's been news reports as well about how much the price of dogs has increased. And the fertility changes in the 1918 flu pandemic has also been used to sort of indicate how the lockdown and non-pharmaceutical interventions might affect fertility as we go forwards. There's also been a discussion about qualitative secondary data analysis. So Tarrant and Hughes say, as the lockdown makes traditional approaches to qualitative research challenging, now is an appropriate time for us to reconsider the tendency for primary data generation to be the go-to form of field work and new research. And Lynn Jameson says the substitution of virtual means of data collection for face-to-face means such as interviewing and internet telephony is not the only possible answers, and researchers might be able to, if they're at the design stage, might be able to consider the creative possibilities of drawing together existing archived qualitative data for new research. So some of it's, why is it appropriate in the lockdown? Well, it's already collected data, and it's less impacts of social and physical restrictions, and there's a speed and cost saving, so you can produce timely research in some circumstances. But even so, rich and in-depth insights can be achieved by reusing ostensibly small data sets and samples, by revisiting and repurposing old or previously collected data. And what I want to do is for a few people is to signpost some of the resources and ways to access data. So one example is the UK Data Service in the UK, and this has a range of access to data from various studies, surveys, longitudinal surveys, census data, and so on. So things like the British Social Attitude Survey and the Citizenship Survey, Eurobarometer, and the European Election Study, so international ones, and longitudinal studies like the 1970 British cohort study, English longitudinal study of aging and understanding society that I already mentioned. In terms of other sources, Mel mentioned the mass observation project earlier, and in the context of elicitation and how, expression, and how people have been writing or expressing themselves in increasingly in the pandemic, and the mass observation had an experience of that with themselves. For those of you that don't know, mass observation has a panel of regular writers. They have anonymous submissions, but there's lots of writing and poetry and pictures and so on, and a large archive. But researchers can also work with mass observation to generate what they call directives. Some of these are done by mass observation themselves, and some are in collaboration with researchers who are interested in particular questions and looking to get certain kinds of information out. So they have a writing day once a year, and they had one on the 12th of May 2020, and they had a huge volume of submissions. So more people were writing, and more people wrote more. So that's an interesting qualitative collection, but as I say, it's anonymous. And another example is Reanimating Data project, which was revisiting an archive from a previous project on women, AIDS and risk, which is from the late 1980s. And it's a series of interviews with people in London and Manchester. And this is able to ask certain feminist questions in this particular project. And so it's a nice resource for research students looking to carry out original feminist research, according to Garnstrom, who is writing about this. So to a quick summary of secondary data analysis, it's certainly an option at the design stage. There's a huge amount of work that needs to be done in terms of what questions one's going to ask, and the relationship between the researcher and the data and the data source, and how that's going to be repurposed, and so lots of epistemological questions, and but there is possible funding. But one of the key things I think is that people need to be able to find and know about the data sets and know where to look for those. So that's part of our project here.